There was a problem. Now it's okay. I think so. I have addressed the problem. Please. Please. You're taking time. Hello. Well, uh, some of you told me that in my last session you missed pleasure. You said that, but I've seen that recording that is posted in the group already. So I'll start with taking cue from that section. So I said that Coleridge ended the age-old controversy, the aim of poetry. What is the immediate aim of poetry? Is it instruction or delight? And he says that the aim of poetry is definitely to give pleasure. So the aim of poetry is to give pleasure, and then he adds that there is something distinctive in it, distinctive pleasure in poetry. The pleasure that we get from poetry, that is a bit different from that of other pleasures that we get. And here he says that we get from poetry is the pleasure that arises from the parts, from the componential parts, and this pleasure, the pleasure that we get from, they support and increase the pleasure of the whole. So what pleasure we get from the parts, that pleasure supports and increases the, that the pleasure that we get from poetry, or the pleasure that we get from legitimate poetry according to Coleridge, is that pleasure. That pleasure is an unbroken pleasure trip from the parts to the whole. And this is only possible because of the organic unity that is there in a. Okay? Fine. Now, his idea about poem and poetry. So again, we will face a certain confusion regarding. We think that poetry and poem is almost synonymous, but Coleridge will here show that what is poetry exactly, and he will extend the very idea of poetry, and he will differentiate poetry or poem. Now, Coleridge distinguishes a poem from a poetry. Now, here I would like to take some idea from Shawcross, Shawcross, Shawcross. I will give you the details of Shawcross's book. Shawcross says that the distinction that Coleridge made between poetry and poem is not very clear. So Shawcross is actually criticizing Coleridge's definition and distinction that Coleridge made between poetry and poem, and he says that instead of defining poetry, Shawcross says that instead of defining poetry, Coleridge is actually describing a poet. He says that Coleridge is not defining poetry, but Coleridge is defining a poet. And from the poet, from defining a poet, he proceeds to deal with the characteristics of imagination. Now, we all know that Coleridge was a bit haphazard, and he actually was not a very organized writer, and most of his works we have seen remained incomplete, and he actually digressed a lot exactly of his work. So doing the differentiation between poetry and poem, Chokra says that Coleridge, instead of doing that, he did what? He proceeds to describe from describing a poet, he moves to the characteristics of imagination. Why Coleridge did so? Why did he do so? So this is because poetry for Coleridge, actually Coleridge had a very different idea and conception about poetry. Now, poetry for Coleridge is an activity of the poet's mind. So to Coleridge, poetry is not that something written in a page and then getting it published with proper stanza division and there will be rhyming and so on. To Coleridge, poetry was something much more philosophical. So to Coleridge, poetry is the activity of the poet's mind. What is going on within the poet? What is the function that is happening within the poet? That is poetry. And to Coleridge, poem is what? Poem is merely one of the forms of its expression. Poetry is what? Activity of the poet. So just try to understand this. Poetry is, according to Coleridge, an activity of the poet's mind, and poem for Coleridge is of its expression. So what is happening within the poet, that is poetry. Within in a form, what he expresses to understand. So a poetry is an act of mind, is forms of its expression. A poem is one of the forms of its expression. And he then goes on describing, it is an verbal of that activity. So a poem is a verbal expression of on mind. A poem is merely a verbal expression of that activity. So, and then he says that kind of activity of imagination. He brings, Coleridge did a good lot of work about on differentiating fancy and primary and secondary imagination, and then he says that now he relates his ideas on imagination and fancy, primary imagination and secondary imagination with his concept of poetry, and he says that poetry is actually an activity of the poet's mind, and that activity is that activity of the imagination. And poem is what? Poem is a verbal expression. So, poetry is an activity of the poet's mind, and poem is a verbal expression of that activity. Now here, you all know that there is a very famous book, David Deutsch's, and if in your undergraduate classes I think you have read David Deutsch's. Now Deutsch says that poetry for Coleridge, now let's try to understand this, poetry for Coleridge is a wider category than that of a poem. Now Deutsch's actually is extending Coleridge's idea of poetry, and he says that it is something much more than a verbal expression. It is something much more than the poem itself. So Shawcross says that Coleridge actually believed that poetry is the activity of the poet's mind and poem is the verbal expression of that activity. Now, David Dages extends this idea and says that poetry is something much more extended than the poem. It is not just the activity which gets verbally expressed through poem. So he says that poetry is something which can include any artistic creation. It is a kind of activity that can be engaged, that the painters can undertake, or the philosophers or scientists, anybody can deal with poetry when that person, either a philosopher or a historian or a painter or any person dealing with any kind of creative work, he or she can be engaged in poetry when there is the activity of imagination going on within him. So he says that this activity of poetry, which can be engaged in by painters or philosophers or scientists, and is not just confined to those artists who employ metrical language. So poetry is not only the property of the poets who deal with metrical language. A painter can be a poet, can also deal with poetry when a painter is having within him, one who is dealing with the secondary imagination or primary imagination, whatever it is, primary imagination and secondary imagination, when in the activity of imagination is functional in the mind of any artist, he or she is actually engaged in poetry. Is it okay? Poetry in this large brings soul of man into activity. Rachel says that when a person is dealing with poetry, that means when a person is working with the imagination, when the imagination is functional within an artist, in the mind of the artist, his or her whole soul is there actively engaged, and each and every faculty of that artist is they are playing their proper parts according to its relative worth and dignity. Just see how he brings in the very idea of organic unity and relates that with the very idea of imagination. He says that first he says that according to Coleridge, poetry is something which has a connection with imagination. So, a poet who is writing a poem or who is engaged in writing metrical language can only deal with an artist who has an imaginative faculty, or in whom the imagination is functional. He or she is actually engaged in poetry. And there, as the imagination is working in the mind of the poet or in the mind of that artist, each and every faculty, observation, like the observation, emotion, intellect, everything, all the sense organs, they are being their worth and dignity. Suppose the artist saw something. When he saw, he had got an impression, and then the primary imagination started working, and then the secondary imagination started working with dissolving, diffusing and dissipating and all this. So all these componential parts that is there in the mind of an artist, they are all working according to their dignity and worth. And this takes place when all the componential parts are in action according to their worth and dignity. whenever the secondary imagination is in operation. When all these things happens, observation, impression, then dissolving, diffusing and dissipating, all these things, when all these things happen, when the secondary imagination is functional. So when an artist is working within in his mind with all the componential parts which are working according to their relative worth and dignity, then the secondary imagination in the mind of that artist is functional. So we can say that as A equal to B and A equal to C, then B equal to is C, because a poetry means it is the work of imagination. And then he says that a poetry, any artist, not only the poet, can be engaged in poetry when all his componential parts which are there in his mind, like the emotion, intellect, observation, all these are working according to their relative worth and dignity. Then poetry is happening. The mind is working on poetry. And when all these things are happening, means all the componential parts are working according to their relative worth and dignity. That means these particular things happen when the secondary imagination is functional. So an artist having secondary imagination, and that artist can, who is involving all his componential parts componential parts with relative dignity and work, functional. That means that artist is involved in secondary imagination. So a poetry is not only a property of the poet who only deals with metrical language. Poetry is something much more extended than the very idea of a poem. A poem is just a verbal, it is a verbal expression of poetry, but poetry is something much more than that. So all poems are poetry, but all poetries are not poems. Other expressions of art, artistic expressions like painting, writing novels, singing, anything can be poetry when the artist is having the secondary imagination functional in him. And then again he says that when the secondary imagination is functional, that means all the componential parts of that artistic mind is working according to their relative worth and dignity. That means all the componential parts are in an organic unity. So we can relate that poetry equals to organic unity equals to the function of secondary imagination. Is it clear? Fine. Comes into operation. Whenever actually the mind, what is happening in the mind when the secondary imagination is functioning? There is synthesizing, there is integration, and all this synthesizing, integration, that means that it tends to dissolving, diffusing and dissipating. Okay, now the employment of the secondary imagination, then it is a poetic activity. I said it's a poetic activity, and we can see why Coleridge is led from a discussion of a poem to the discussion of a poet's activity. Now Shawcross criticized Coleridge on the point that Coleridge instead he proposed that he is going to differentiate poem and poetry, and actually he did what? He actually moved on to do what? To divide the poet and the poetic activity. Actually he did this because he wanted to establish the fact that poetic activity means what is going on in the poet's mind, and what is going on in the poet's mind, if that has to be a poetic activity, then what is going on in the poet's mind is actually secondary imagination. And secondary imagination can be functional only when there is an organic unity of all the componential parts of the poet's mind. Okay, so now we can get the idea that what Shawcross has said criticizing Coleridge is actually something different, because Coleridge's intention was something different. A poem is always the work of a poet. On the other hand, a poem is always the work of a poet. What a poet writes is a poem. But poetry is not the sole property of the poets. A poem is always the work of a poet, of a man employing secondary imagination and so achieving the harmony of meaning. But poetry is something different. Poetry means the poetic activity happening within the mind of the poet, where the secondary imagination is functioning, where all the componential parts of the poet's mind has a sort of order. Now, the harmony and reconciliation, what is happening within the poet? Harmony and reconciliation of all the componential parts, resulting from a special kind of creative awareness achieved by the exercise of unity, why all the componential parts are working according to their own relative worth and dignity, because there the imagination is, there is the awareness achieved by the exercise of the imagination. And for an Coleridge gives a different idea. He says that the secondary imagination can be functional, not so he says that this imagination cannot extend for a long period of time. He says that one could not sustain actually that blending and balance and reconciliation of same, of the general and the concrete, the idea, the image. So in secondary imagination, it dissolves, diffuses and dissipates. Now Coleridge functions for a long period of time, and the individual with the representative cannot continue for a long period of time. That's why he says that a long poem, if a poem is long, a long poem would not be all poetry. He says that, I said that all poems can be poetry, then Coleridge modified long poems can be poetry. Why? Because he says that the second imagination cannot sustain for a long period of time. So he says that a long poem cannot be a poem. Imagination cannot remain functional throughout. So he says that Coleridge goes on to the extent of saying that there is no such long poem. Is criticizing Wordsworth because Wordsworth had so many long poems. Okay. So he says, as a long poem, if a poem is poem, then it is not long, and if a poem, that is not poem at all. That was what Coleridge wanted to say. So rhyme, and it says rhyme and meter are appropriate to the poem, larger sense of. He says that what he wants to establish as poetry, which happens in the mind of a poet, he says that rhyme and meter, they are appropriate to a poem which is is happening, which is actually happening in the mind. They are means of rhyme and meter, means with which the poetry itself achieves harmony. It harmonizes and it reconciliates opposites, and as we have seen, which are the poetry in imaginative meaning. So here, just sum up this section, I will see Coleridge says that there is a difference. While doing so, he from that idea which he propounded and goes on explaining and exploring the mind of the poet and what happens in the mind of the poet, and which and then he says that whatever an artistic mind is doing by organic employing and involving exponential parts into a creation, that is poetry. And poem is just a verbal expression of poetry, which has metrical poem, and the poet writes that is poem. And a poetry is something which happens within the mind of the poet by combining all the componential parts with their relative dignity and worth, where actually the secondary imagination is functional. And then secondary imagination remains functional not for a period of time, and that's why there cannot be a long poetry. He says that such thing as long. This is the thing. And now he goes on to describe what he meant by unity, organic unity. So Coleridge gave a very political term, what I say, that's legitimate poetry. Very much serious about establishing his own idea about poetic creation, and that's why he says that the qualities that he established, if the in only a legitimate poetry, was I think that Coleridge was a bit dogmatic here in this respect. That is, his legitimate poem, which is a legitimate poem, a poem becomes when it has qualities of poetry. So a legitimate poem is actually a poetry in the true sense of there is perfect unity of form and content. A poem becomes a legitimate poem when there is a perfect combination of form and content. Can you get me? Okay. So Coleridge says that a legitimate poem should have a perfect unity of form and content. The perfect unity of form and content. Now, the notion of such organic unity we find in all of Coleridge's pronouncements of poetry. Now, you can see. Now, I'm back again. Hello? Is it okay? Is it okay now? Okay. Now, the notion of such organic unity we find in all of Coleridge's pronouncements of poetry. Now, he says that rhyme and meter, I have said earlier, that rhyme and meter are not pleasure superadded. And here he is controverting Wordsworth's position on the subject. Now, what did Wordsworth say? That for Wordsworth had some ideas about rhyme and meter that we will discuss while dealing with Wordsworth's idea. So he says that rhyme and meter are not super added to poetry. Why? He says, because he says that nothing can permanently please, what I said earlier in the last session, nothing can permanently please which does not contain in itself the reason why it is so. So he says that nothing can permanently please, it won't give you permanent pleasure if that combination of two things, suppose the form and content or rhyme and meter and the content of the poem, whatever, it cannot give you permanent pleasure if that combination, that association has no logical reasoning of association behind it. Okay. Reason in itself why it is so and not otherwise. So he says nothing that is super added, merely stuck on for ornament or decoration, something which is super added only for decoration, only for ornament, he says, can really please. He says that what something is, if something is super added as ornament or decoration, it won't give you permanent pleasure. If something is added or associated or combined with a logical reasoning of combination behind it, then only that association or that addition will give you permanent pleasure. And here he brings in the idea of organic unity. That means all the componential parts will help to give meaning to the whole, and the whole will also validate and give meaning to the parts. Now Coleridge says, here's a line from Coleridge, rhyme and meter are integral to the poem. He says that rhyme and meter are integral to the poem. That means, I'll say Anisha, for Wordsworth, I will come to Wordsworth later. Coleridge, actually, when I will be dealing with Coleridge's criticism on Wordsworth, I will bring this idea. Otherwise, there will be a problem, there will be a confusion. So just concentrate on this point that he said that rhyme and meter, if they are super added, they won't give you permanent pleasure. And he says that nothing that is super added, that will give pleasure. If something is super added, they are decoration, they are ornamentation, and that won't give you permanent pleasure. Okay. So he says that rhyme and meter are integral to the poem, an essential part of it. What Coleridge says, rhyme and meter are integral to the poem, an essential part of it. Why? Because the pleasure of poetry is a special kind of pleasure. So I said that there is a distinctive type of pleasure in poetry in my last session. He says the pleasure of poetry is a special kind of pleasure. What? Pleasure which results both from the parts and the whole. Okay. So he says that poetry has a distinctive type of pleasure. Why? Because the pleasure in poetry that the reader gets, the pleasure comes both from the part as well as from the whole. As I said, that the pleasure that we find in poetry is an unbroken pleasure trip from the parts to the whole. Both from the parts and whole, and the pleasure arising from the parts, so pleasure actually arises from the parts and augments the pleasure of the whole. So what I said, that is, the pleasure that we get in poetry is an unbroken pleasure trip from the parts to the whole. The pleasure arises from the parts and augments or increases or enriches the pleasure of the whole. Okay, so he says that rhyme and meter, when they are not super added, when rhyme and meter, they are added with a logical reasoning of addition behind it, there the recurrence of accent and sound, they do what? So in rhyme and meter, what do we find? There is a recurrence of accent and sound. They invite attention to the pleasure of each separate parts. So when you find that all the last syllables of each and every line are rhyming, or alternately they are rhyming, you are getting a sort of pleasure from that part, and the pleasure that you are getting from these parts actually help you to appreciate and enjoy the whole poem, or the poem as a whole. When therefore meter is thus in consonance with the language, so when the meter is in association with the language of the poem, it does what? It excites a perpetual and distinct attention to each part. So suppose I'm quoting a few lines from Shakespeare's sonnet number 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempest and is never shaken. Love's not time's fool, the rosy lips and cheeks, within his bending sickle's compass stand. So you will find that there is some internal rhyme within the poem, and this lilting lines, the rhyme that is there within the lines of the poem, they give you pleasure as parts, and the pleasure that you are deriving from the parts ultimately help you to appreciate and enjoy poem as a whole. Okay, so therefore meter is thus in consonance with the language, and it excites a sort of perpetual and distinct attention to each part. Okay, now by distinct attention of when therefore meter is thus in consonance with the language and content of the poem, it excites, what I said, a perpetual and distinct attention to each and every part. By how? By the quick reciprocations of curiosity. So when you are reading a line in a poem, you are having a sort of curiosity that how this particular line will rhyme with the next or the alternate line, or in a 4-line stanza, how the line 1 and line 4 rhymes and line 2 and line 3 rhymes, or interlocking rhymes or alternate rhymes. So it gives you a sort of curiosity to go through the poem, and it allows you to appreciate the poem, to enjoy the poem. So the enjoyment moves from the part to the whole and carries the reader forward to the end, and the whole journey becomes a very pleasurable journey. And it is how actually the reader enjoys and appreciates the work of art. So there is no stopping for the reader on the way, attracted by the parts. So it is not like that. The parts which are there, which helps to form the whole, the particular parts which give you pleasure, which pleases you, they are not hindering or disturbing your journey, but the pleasure that you are getting from the parts are giving you a sort of momentum to move forward, to arrive at the end of the poem, so that the parts give you pleasure to arrive at the end of the poem and have a taste of the overall poem or the whole poem. So this is what I said as an unbroken pleasure trip from the parts to the whole. It is one unbroken pleasure trip. Okay, now this is what Coleridge's theory was about poetry and poetic creation. I think all of you have got an idea about that. Now, if I sum up Coleridge's idea of poetry and poetical creation, so the first thing, what is Coleridge's contribution? First thing is, he puts an end for good to the age-old controversy. The first important thing is, he puts an end to the controversy that what is the aim of poetry? Is it instruction or delight or both? And he says, and he establishes that the immediate aim of poetry is pleasure, and in the end what the readers get is pleasure. That pleasure may help the reader to arrive at certain truth, but that is not important in the context of poetry. And he says that poetry has its own distinctive pleasure. Here it is not pleasure in the general sense of the term. Poetry has its own distinctive pleasure, that pleasure which is which is an unbroken pleasure trip, the pleasure that you get from an unbroken pleasure trip from the parts to the whole. This is one. Second, he explodes the neoclassical view of poetry as imitation, that poetry is not just an imitation. Even Sidney has said, Sidney also retained the word imitation in his definition of poetry. He says that it is not imitation and shows that it is an activity of imagination. Poetry is not imitation, but it is an activity of imagination. And for that, while discussing poetry, while dealing with poetry, while exploring poetry, he actually focused on the activity that goes on in the mind of the artist. He extended the very idea of poetry and differentiated poetry from poem. The latter is just a verbal expression of that poetical activity. He explodes the neoclassical idea that poetry is not just an imitation, but it is an activity of the imagination which has the esemplastic power of recreating, reshaping, remolding by dissolving, dissipating and diffusing. So he says that poetry is the result of the function of the secondary imagination which dissolves, diffuses and dissipates. And thirdly, point 3, he shows that in its very nature, poetry must differ from prose. It is not that if you add or put rhyme and meter into a prose work, that will become poetry. And he says that if that happens, that may look like poetry, but that is not poetry, because their rhyme and meter are super added to it, and they are not an intricate part of that particular work of art, where they remains only as ornament or decoration, and they lack the organic unity. Therefore, they cannot give permanent pleasure to the readers. He says that poetry and prose should have their own differences. He controverts Wordsworth's view that rhyme and meter are merely superadded. Wordsworth say that rhyme and meter are merely superadded. They are extraneous. They are for decoration only. The content is only important, but Coleridge said that no, the content is not just important. The form, structure, rhyme and meter, they are also important, but their importance lies in the very fact that they should be organically united. Otherwise, they will fail to give permanent pleasure to the readers. Okay. So these are the 3 points that sum up Coleridge's idea of poetical activity and poetical creation. So do you want to call it a day? Do you want to end today, or should I start Wordsworth? I think I should finish today. Please give me your suggestions. How was the class? Did you like the class? Is there any problem? If you want to ask any question, you can ask. Do you want me to continue, or should I end the class? Do you have any question? Then you can ask. I'm waiting for your response. What do you want, Anvesha? Oh, you want to end the class today? Thank you. It's almost 9:30. So we shall call it a day. Is there any problem, any confusion, any question do you want to ask? Okay, so Rudrajit has a question that why secondary imagination cannot sustain in longer poems. This is what Coleridge actually, that was Coleridge's belief. He said that actually the function of secondary imagination is very critical. It is very critical because there the various faculties of the mind, they are actually in function and they are logically combined, associated with their relative worth and dignity. Okay, now Coleridge believed that this critical thing, this critical process cannot continue for a long period of time, and that's why Coleridge says that it can only happen in a short poem. Secondary imagination has to continue or has to retain its function for a long period of time, which according to Coleridge is not possible, because secondary imagination, the functions of secondary imagination is so critical, it cannot continue for a long period of time. That's why Coleridge says that secondary imagination cannot remain for a long period of time in a long poem. That's why he says that long poems are not poetry. Okay. Any question? Okay, if you missed the word, it will be uploaded in this group. I think that in the full video you will get all the words, and still if you have any problem you can give me a call. I will try to help you out. Okay, till then call it a day. Thank you. I will give you the next day tomorrow. My 4th sem students in the evening. So if I get time, then tomorrow I just want to have a 30 minutes class with you only to introduce Wordsworth's view, and only then I will be able to start Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth. I need a 30 minutes or a 20 to 30 minutes class. So I think tomorrow at around yes, if according to Wordsworth meter is super added, then incompatibility arises. So can it lead to truth? Yes, that is the thing. No, here that was Wordsworth's idea. That's why I wanted to introduce Wordsworth's idea. Only then there would have been no confusion. Actually, Wordsworth said that the content, the thing, the thought which is there in the poem, that is only important, and rhyme and meter are just added to it. But Coleridge criticized this, that rhyme and meter, if they are only just added, if they are only extraneously associated with the content of the poem, then it won't give you permanent pleasure. Coleridge says that rhyme and meter are not always, in all cases, they are super added. But if there is a sort of organic unity between the content and the form, or rhyme and meter and the content of the poem, then only that poem can give permanent pleasure to the readers. But Wordsworth did not give focus on this thing, and to him rhyme and meter, they are always, in all cases, they are extraneous or superadded. That is the thing. Okay, so just suggest if I can take a 30 minutes class tomorrow morning, say around at 11. Is it possible? Just tell me. Okay, I'll finish. Thank you. Have a nice time. Good night. Stay safe. Don't go out.